Wyoming Territory, June 1886. The sun was just cresting over the Absaroka Range when Hollis Zeller stepped off the porch of her mother's house for the last time, her hands scraped, her cheeks still wet, and her heart dead set on never coming back. "You are nothing, girl," her mother had hissed that morning, voice sharp as broken glass. "No man in his right mind would want you. You are worthless, just like your drunk of a father." Hollis had not said a word in return. She had just picked up her satchel, wrapped her shawl tight around her shoulders, and walked down the dirt road without a single look back. She had been told that line for years, since she was 12, and her father put a bullet through his own head out in the barn. Her mother never forgave her for surviving it. She had nowhere clear to go, only the vague direction of the McCabe Ranch, where she had once heard they might be looking for help with the herd. She had no experience with cattle, but she could mend, cook, clean, and keep her mouth shut. That alone had kept her breathing this long. It was nearly 2 hours later when the wind picked up and she spotted a rider approaching from the west. Dust rose behind him, his hat pulled low, his frame tall and sure in the saddle. A palomino gelding carried him, sweat glistening on the horse's neck as it approached. Hollis pulled her shawl tighter and stepped off the road. The man slowed his horse and tipped his hat. "You all right, miss?" she nodded, eyes down. "I am fine. You are a good ways from town and there ain't nothing but hard land in the direction you are heading." "I know," she said. He studied her a long moment. "You headed somewhere. I am looking for work." "What kind of work?" "Any kind." He dismounted. There was no threat in his movement, only calm, steady purpose. He looked about 30, maybe a bit older. Dust clung to his coat and boots, but his eyes were clear and blue and kind. "I am Nolan McCabe," he said, extending a hand. "I own the ranch just up ahead." "You are walking straight toward it." She looked up at him then, surprised. "I heard you might need help." His mouth tightened, not in anger but as if making a decision. "You any good with a needle?" "Can you cook?" "I can do both." "You got a place to sleep?" "No." "Well," he said, glancing behind him toward the hills. "Then I reckon you do now." She hesitated. "You do not know me." "I do not need to. You are here, you are honest, and you are not trying to sell me anything." "That is more than I can say for half the folks I know." And just like that, she followed him. The McCabe Ranch sprawled across the valley like it belonged there, tucked between low hills and a creek that ran cold and clear. There were 3 hands working the cattle, an old cook named Doris who barely spoke, and a bunkhouse that smelled like leather, smoke, and sweat. Nolan gave her a small room in the main house, with a window that looked east and a bed with clean linens. She had never known such silence at night. The next morning she was up before the sun, helping Doris with breakfast and sweeping the porch before the men rolled out of bed. Nolan came in last, quiet as always, nodding his thanks when she handed him a cup of coffee. He never asked questions she did not want to answer. By the end of the week, she had mended every torn shirt in the bunkhouse, cleaned the tack room, and started tending the small vegetable garden Doris had long given up on. Nolan watched her from a distance, respectful but present. He never pushed, never hovered, but somehow always knew when she needed help lifting a crate or when her hands were shaking too much to slice bread. One afternoon, she was scrubbing the porch steps when she heard raised voices. She looked up to see a woman in a blue traveling dress standing on the path, her arms crossed, her face pinched and proud. "Nolan," the woman said, her voice like frost. "What is that girl doing here?" Nolan stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "That girl works here now." "That girl," the woman snapped, eyeing Hollis, "is the Zeller girl. Her mother is still causing trouble in town. You know what they say about her." "I do not care what they say." "She is nothing," the woman said. She will bring shame on you, same as her father did." Nolan's jaw tightened. He looked at Hollis, then back at the woman. "You are wrong. She is all I have ever needed around here." The woman scoffed and turned away, muttering something under her breath. Hollis stared at him, her hands still wet from the bucket. "You did not have to say that," she whispered when the woman was gone. "I meant it." She looked away, not knowing what to do with the way her chest ached, not from pain but from something warmer. That evening she found Nolan in the barn, brushing down his horse. She stood in the door a long moment before speaking. "Why do you trust me?" He looked up, brushing hair from his brow. "Because I know what it means to be left behind. My pa died in a cattle stampede when I was 10. My ma remarried and moved back east, left me with the ranch and a neighbor to raise me. I know what it is like to be called not enough." She stepped inside, her fingers twisting in her apron. "I do not know what to do when someone is kind to me," she said quietly. "You do not have to do anything," he said. "You just have to stay." And she did. The days turned easier. She smiled more. He brought her wildflowers one morning, left on the porch in a tin cup. She baked him peach cobbler with what little fruit she could trade for in town. He showed her how to saddle a horse, how to ride, how to shoot straight. She found herself laughing, something she had not done in years. She did not know it yet, but they were already building a life. One quiet day at a time. The summer deepened, and the cottonwoods thickened their leaves along the creek, casting long green shadows over the water. Hollis had taken to sitting there in the late afternoons after the chores were through, letting the breeze lift the sweat from her brow, while her fingers worked embroidery into a feed sack. She turned into a pillow cover. She didn't speak much during those quiet hours, but Nolan had started joining her now and again, sitting a few feet off with his boots in the grass and a knife in his hand, whittling slowly. One evening, while the sun dipped low and turned the sky the color of rusted copper, Nolan ran his thumb along the edge of the wood he was shaping. "Ever think about staying?" he asked. Hollis didn't look up. "I already am. I mean for good." She rested the needle in her lap. "I don't have anything to go back to." "That's not the same as wanting to stay." She didn't answer right away. A pair of sandhill cranes called out from upriver, their wings flashing through the trees. "I don't know what it means to stay anywhere by choice." He nodded and went back to his carving, the blade rasping softly. After a while, she picked up her work again. The silence between them wasn't heavy, it breathed. 2 days later, word came by way of a rider from town that the river had swelled near the north pasture. Nolan saddled up to check it, taking one of his hands with him. Hollis volunteered to ride out with food and dry socks in the evening, and he didn't argue it. She packed biscuits, a tin of boiled beans, and a strip of salt pork in a cloth wrap. By the time she reached the pasture, the light was going gold. The river had flattened the grass in wide, muddy swaths, but the cattle were safe. Nolan stood near the fence line, sleeves rolled up, water marks drying on his boots. "You didn't have to come all this way," he said, eyeing the bundle in her arms. "I did," she said. "You wouldn't have eaten otherwise." He gave a quiet huff through his nose. "That's likely true." She handed him the food and he motioned toward a fallen log. They sat, sharing the meal in companionable quiet. When they finished, he folded the cloth and set it aside. "You ever think about what you'd want if no one was watching?" She looked at him, startled. "No one's ever asked me that. I'm asking now." She clasped her hands in her lap. "A place to call mine, not fancy. Something I could tend to, maybe a few goats, a garden, quiet." He nodded. "Sounds like something a person could build." "With what?" His eyes found hers. "With time. With someone who wants the same." She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. That night, back at the house, the wind picked up. Hollis lay awake listening to it comb through the trees. She thought about the way Nolan's voice had gone soft when he talked about building something. Not just a home, a life. The next morning, she rose before dawn and headed to the barn. She'd noticed one of the young colts limping the day before, and she wanted to see to it before the sun got too high. As she crouched near its hoof, Nolan stepped in, hands still damp from washing. "You're up early. So are you." His gaze drifted to the colt. "You've got a good eye. I watch for what others miss." He leaned against the stall gate. "You do that with people too," she stood, brushing hay from her skirt. "Only the ones who don't turn away." That drew a slow grin from him, not for show, but the sort that settled in the corners of a man's face when he heard something that mattered. They didn't speak again until the colt finished eating and the sun crept higher across the hills. As they walked back toward the house, he slowed his steps beside her. "I've been thinking," he said. "There's a parcel just east of the creek past the line of cottonwoods. It's got good soil. Water runs nearby." She gave him a puzzled look. "What about it?" "I've never done anything with it." "But I could fence it in. Build something small if you wanted it." She stopped walking. "You'd give me land." "I'd give you whatever you needed to stay." Her throat tightened. She looked down at her boots, at the worn toe of her left one and the way the dust had settled in the creases. "Nobody's ever offered me anything without wanting something back." "I don't want anything," he said. "Except maybe to sit beside you in the evenings, maybe share coffee come morning." She let out a shaky breath, then looked up. "You ask like I've got a choice." "You do." She studied his face, steady, open, weather-lined but kind. "Then yes," she said. "I want it, not just the land." He nodded once, as if sealing something quiet and sacred between them. They walked on, the morning opening wide before them like the land itself, rich, waiting, full of promise. The parcel Nolan had spoken of lay beyond a narrow rise, where the cottonwoods thinned and the air smelled of sweetgrass and damp earth. By early July, he had cleared the brush himself, dragging cedar rails one by one to mark the boundary. Hollis brought water and bread, but otherwise let him work, knowing better than to interrupt a man when he was laying something down for the future. One evening, after the sky had turned dim and the fireflies had begun to blink along the creek, he found her in the garden kneeling between rows of beans. His boots stopped just short of her shadow. "I bought nails and hinges in town," he said. "Started framing the door today." She brushed soil from her fingers. "You're not wasting time." "I never saw the point in waiting when something felt right." She stood, brushing her apron down. "What'll it look like?" "Small. One room to start. Wood stove in the corner. Window over the bed if you want it." "I'd like that." He nodded, then added, "We could build it together if you'd rather. I never held a hammer in my life." "Then I'll show you." The next morning, she rolled up her sleeves and followed him to the site. He handed her a square-cut nail and a strip of pine. "Hold it steady." She did, though her hand trembled once. He noticed but said nothing, just waited until she exhaled and found her grip again. She struck the nail with the side of the hammer, missed, then tried again. The third time, it went clean in. By midday, her shoulders ached and her palms had gone pink, but the frame of the back wall stood upright. Nolan leaned against a post and ran a hand over his jaw, watching her. "You pick things up faster than most." "I've had reason to." He didn't ask what those reasons were. Instead, he offered a strip of dried venison and sat beside her in the shade. "I had a brother once," she said after a while. "Caleb. He was older by 2 years. Ran off when I was 15. I don't know where he went. Folks said he probably ended up dead in Cheyenne, but I always thought maybe he made it past the mountains." "You ever think about looking for him?" "I did. But I didn't have a horse or a dollar to my name, and Ma would have rather died than let me go." He chewed quietly, then swallowed. "If he's out there, he lost something when he left you behind." She shook her head. He was the only one who ever tried to keep me safe. You think he'd approve of all this? She looked toward the rising frame. I think he'd be surprised I lasted this long. But yes, I think he'd be glad. They worked until the sun fell behind the hills and Nolan walked her back to the house. As they reached the porch, she paused. My mother came to the ranch once, didn't she? He shifted, the boards creaking under his boots. She did. What did she say? He looked at her a long moment before answering. She said you were nothing. That you'd bring shame on me. And you, I told her she was wrong, that you're all I've ever needed. Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. You meant that. I wouldn't have said it if I didn't. I'm not used to being needed. You will be. That night, Holly sat alone in her room, the breeze lifting the lace curtain Nolan had hung for her weeks back. She traced the grain of the windowsill with her thumb, feeling the smoothness where time had worn it. She thought of her brother's laugh, the way he used to whistle through his teeth, and wondered what he'd say if he saw her now. The next day, she took an axe to the cedar logs Nolan had stacked near the fence. She split them until her arms ached, sweat trickling into her collar. When he found her, he didn't scold, just handed her a tin cup of water and sat beside her on the grass. "Why do you work so hard?" he asked. "Because for the first time in my life, I'm building something that won't be taken from me." He leaned back, resting on his elbows. "That's how I felt when I took over this land." She turned toward him. "What did it give you?" "Purpose. And eventually, peace." "Do you think that's something I could have?" "I think it's already yours. You just haven't learned how to wear it yet." She looked away, blinking against the sun. "Nolan, I'm scared." "Of what?" "That I'll want too much." He sat up close now, his voice low. "You can want anything you like. I want a life. A real one, not just surviving." "You're not surviving anymore, you're living. You just haven't stopped to feel it yet." She reached for his hand and he let her take it. His calluses met hers, rough and real. They sat that way until the crickets began to chirp and the sky burned itself out. Neither rushed to let go. By the middle of August, the walls were up. Nolan had planed each board himself, and Hollis had learned to drive nails without splitting the wood. They worked in rhythm, seldom needing words. The house hers, though Nolan never said so outright, stood tucked against the rise, where the wind bent the grasses but never broke them. One morning, as they secured the roof beams, a rider came loping from the south trail. Dust clung to his sleeves and his horse moved like it had run hard for miles. Nolan climbed down from the ladder, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. The man reined in. "Marshall's been asking after you," he said, eyes flicking toward Hollis. "Your name came up in town." Nolan's jaw shifted. "Why?" "Said your place is harboring someone the town wants answers from, that Zeller girl." Hollis didn't flinch, but the hammer in her hand lowered. Nolan crossed his arms. "She's not hiding. She lives here now." The rider hesitated. "Marshall's got no charges, far as I heard. Just pressure from folks who don't like seeing someone rise above their station. She's not their concern." "I told him the same," the rider said, "but he might come calling anyway." When he was gone, Nolan didn't speak right away. He picked up a length of timber and hoisted it to the sawhorse. Hollis stood still, the sun hot on her neck. "If it causes trouble, I've had trouble before," he said without looking up. "You're not it." She walked to the edge of the rise, staring down the road the rider had come from. "I don't mind being quiet. I've lived quiet most of my life. You shouldn't have to live small just because others want you to." He stepped beside her. "This land's yours now, Hollis. Let them come. They'll find nothing here but work and peace." She turned to him, her voice low. "If they ask, I'll answer. I'm not ashamed of who I am." He met her eyes. "Then neither am I." After that, they returned to their work. Neither spoke of the rider again, but Hollis noticed Nolan checking the fence lines more often. She watched too, not out of fear but readiness. A week later, Doris sent a note up from the main house, folded neatly under a wedge of bread. Hollis opened it by lantern light. The handwriting was tight and proper. "Your mother's been in town again. Drunk loud. She's telling folks you stole from her on your way out." Hollis set the slip aside, folding it once more and tucking it into her apron. Nolan found her splitting kindling behind the half-finished porch an hour later. He stopped a few paces away. "You heard." "I did." "You want to go into town. Speak for yourself." She shook her head. "Wouldn't change anything. They've already decided what they think." He stepped closer. "What do you want, Hollis?" She looked up, the axe still in her grip. "I want to make something that won't rot from the inside." He nodded. "Then we'll keep building." That night, she didn't return to the main house. Nolan had cleared a space for her in the new structure, nothing more than a mattress on the floor and a lantern on a crate, but when she stepped inside, it felt like shelter. He brought in a blanket from the cabin and set it on the bed without saying anything else. As he turned to leave, she caught his sleeve. "I don't have a name for this place," she said. He waited. "I don't want to call it mine, not really. Feels more like ours." His voice was quiet. "Then that's what it is." She watched his hand close around the doorframe, the way his thumb traced the grain. "There's been things left unsaid," she murmured. "There have." "I don't need promises," she said. "But I won't stay where there's doubt." He turned, the lantern light catching the edge of his face. "I've known since the first time you looked me in the eye you were worth every inch of this land and more. If you stay, it's because I want you beside me, not behind, not beneath." "Beside." She didn't speak, just stepped forward, leaned her brow against his chest, and let herself breathe. Outside, the wind shifted. The sounds of cattle lowing in the distance faded into the hush of the hills. Inside, they stood still, not as strangers or debtors, but as two people who had bent toward the same light, slowly, steadily, until they met in its warmth. When morning came, they would return to the build. The roof would be finished, the stove set in place. And when the first frost came down from the north, there would be a fire inside, and two chairs side by side before it. The last of the cabin's shutters were hung in early September, the days thinning at the edges, the wind turning sharper along the ridge. Hollis had stitched a curtain from flour sack muslin, and when she tied it back that morning, the view stretched wide yellowing grass, sloping hills, and beyond, the distant thread of creek where the cattle sometimes wandered. She stepped outside to find Nolan oiling the hinges on the porch door, his coat slung over a rail. He glanced up, wiping his fingers on a scrap of cloth. "Rains'll come soon. You think the roof'll hold?" "It'll hold," she said. "We built it tight." He straightened, brushing dust from his trousers. "There's a man in town who'll marry folks. Preacher retired young, but he still does it quiet-like." She looked at him, her pulse quickening. "I don't expect an answer right off," he said, "but I thought you should know. Just in case you wanted something more permanent than a roof." She stepped closer, hands still damp from washing. "You think I'd make a good wife?" "I think you already have," he said. "You wake before the sun. You make the place feel steady. You call things what they are. I never guessed I'd want someone to share land with, but I do. I want you." She touched the edge of his shirt sleeve, the fabric soft from wear. "Then let's do it." He blinked. "You sure?" "I never thought I'd get to choose anything in my life, but I'm choosing this, not because it's safe. Not because I need it, because I love you." He didn't speak, just stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her, pressing his brow to hers. The wind stirred the curtain behind them, and the sun caught in the curls at the nape of her neck. They rode into town 4 days later, early enough that the streets were still quiet. The preacher's house stood behind the livery, a squat building with whitewashed clapboards and a bell that hadn't tolled in years. He married them in the front room with his wife as witness. her apron still dusted with flour. Hollis wore a dress Doris helped let out from an old trunk. Nolan wore his cleanest shirt and boots that still held the shape of the land. When the preacher asked if they'd come of their own will, they both answered before he finished the question. Afterward, they rode home in silence, her hand resting just above his knee, the horse swaying beneath them. At the cabin, Doris had left a basket on the porch: cold chicken, pickled eggs, and a jar of wild plum preserves. That evening they ate by lanternlight, knees touching beneath the table. Nolan poured coffee into tin cups, and Hollis laid her hand atop his. "You ever think we'd end up like this?" she asked. He shook his head. "Didn't know it was possible." "Me neither." Later, as the wind picked up outside and the stars blinked through the open window, they lay side by side beneath a quilt she'd pieced together from old shirts and flour sacks. He traced the line of her wrist, following the faint scar near her elbow. "What are you thinking?" she whispered. "That I don't remember what it felt like before you came." She turned toward him, pressing her lips to his collarbone. "Then let's never talk about before." By the time the first snow dusted the tops of the cottonwoods, the cabin had settled into itself. A chimney Nolan built by hand carried the smoke clean, and the stove burned hot with split pine. Hollis kept dried apples strung in the pantry and a jar of dried sage on the shelf for winter stew. The hands still came by the main house for pay and supplies, but Nolan spent most of his hours near the cabin now, mending harness, checking fence. They shared the work easily. He taught her to read a weather shift by the tilt of the clouds, and she taught him to find the sweet spot in bread dough by feel alone. One morning, as frost crackled along the porch rail, she stepped outside, a wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Nolan was feeding the chickens, his breath ghosting in the air. She waited until he finished, then reached into her pocket and handed him a folded note. He opened it, brows furrowing, then lifting. "I thought it might be time," she said. He looked up. "You're sure?" She nodded. "Spring, most likely." He crossed the space between them and pulled her into his arms. "We'll make room. We already have." That night he built a cradle from pine offcuts and old fence rail, sanding it smooth by lanternlight. She embroidered a strip of muslin to line the inside, her needle steady, her heart full. They never spoke of her mother again. The land held no memory of her, only of what had been created since. Caleb never came back, but a letter arrived 2 winters later from a place called Raton Pass, with a name she recognized and a promise to visit if ever he could. She tucked it into a box with the marriage certificate and a sprig of dried sage from the garden they planted together. And when the baby came a girl with dark hair and her mother's quiet gaze, they named her Eliza, after no one, because she was the beginning of things, not the echo. In the evenings, when the wind rustled the cottonwoods and the stove glowed steady, Nolan would sit in his chair with Eliza in his arms, and Hollis would lean against the doorframe, her hands still dusted with flour, watching the man she loved rock their daughter to sleep. The land around them did what land always does: it endured, it changed, it grew, and in the house they built, so did they. Together. Always.